Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for pre-order on Amazon and other retail outlets. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. Today's podcast is the first of a trilogy on consciousness and time. My guest is the writer and musician Gary Lachman. Gary is the author of many books on topics ranging from the evolution of consciousness to literary suicides, popular culture, and the history of the occult. He has written a rock and roll memoir of the 1970s, biographies of Aleister Crowley, Rudolf Steiner, C.G. Jung, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Emanuel Swedenborg, P.D. Ouspensky, and Colin Wilson. He has also written histories of Hermeticism and the Western inner tradition, studies in existentialism and consciousness, and about the influence of esotericism on politics and society. As Gary Valentine, he was a founding member of the pop group Blondie, and in 2006 was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Gary was born in New Jersey, but since 1996 has lived in London, UK. We began our talk discussing the persistent and remarkable phenomenon of dreaming the future. This leads to a discussion of the writer and existential philosopher Colin Wilson, who associated future dreaming with something he called Faculty X. We discussed the phenomenon of peak experiences, times when life seems replete with meaning. And we talk about how a general lack of meaning might have contributed to the rise of extreme politics in the US and elsewhere. Dario, I was particularly interested to see that you'd published a book, Dreaming Ahead of Time, because one of the things that kicked off this whole project actually was that I participated back in, it would be 2022 now, at a dream precognition experiment being run by the University of Kent. And basically we had to record our diaries and see whether our dreams matched up with the target. And as I've sort of written in a bit more length, I never expected it to work, but I got 2 hits in a row in both of the runs. And the second one was particularly interesting because I dreamt a lot of sort of habitual stuff, but that I dreamt right at the end there was a dream of a sort of one bear whispering into the ear of another. And then the computer, this was before the computer had chosen a target. So I think it was a couple of days later, they sent us 4 possible targets and we had to guess which one. And there was a sort of baby polar bear lying on top of a big mother bear, and it kind of looked like it was whispering in. So when I read some of your accounts in the book, I was very much sympathetic with what that happened. So let's start off. How did you write that book in the first place?
I wrote it during the first COVID lockdown here, so I guess that's 2020. But my interest in precognitive dreams and my experience of them goes back many, many years. I was when I was a musician, and I was living in New York. And first off, I played in Blondie a long time ago and all that. A song I wrote called "I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear," for my girlfriend at the time, was about these shared dream experiences we had, and kind of telepathic. And the story was uh, we were on the first Blondie North American tour, and Lisa Persky, my girlfriend, she was still in New York, and when we each sort of when I wanted to telephone her, she would be on her way to telephone me, or would have been, or something like that. And this was before, mobile phones, cell phones. You have to be at a certain place at a certain time in order to make a phone call. So tangentially, our whole experience of time now is very, very different than it was just, say, roughly 50 years ago. So, any case, so we just we wound up realizing that we were having the same sorts of dreams. So I wrote the song about that. And then at that time, I started to get very, very interested in the occult and the magical and the mystical. And this mostly was from reading Colin Wilson's book, The Occult, that came out in the early 70s. And I read it in 1975 when I was living on the Bowery with Debbie Harry and Chris Stein playing Blondie. And so I had this indiscriminate interest in everything to do with anything like that. And one of the books he mentioned was a book called An Experiment with Time, a fellow named J.W. Dunn, that came out in the 1920s. And Dunn was an aeronautical engineer. But just by accident, he discovered that bits and pieces of his own future were turning up in his dreams. So it wasn't so much that he was dreaming the future, like, predicting things happening. It would just be something that he would see in the newspaper, or some other everyday common occurrence that is turned up ahead of time. And this would have been about 1980 when I read the book, and I just decided to do what Dunn did and just start copying my dreams down in the morning. And as soon as I did, it was like spot on. I mean, it was just like, oh, you're interested in this? Well, here you go. And I say in the book, it was like, oh my God, it was there. I'll just go quickly. I mean, one was like, I had a dream about playing a red guitar. I didn't have a red guitar. I didn't know anybody who had a red guitar. But on a random walk with a friend, we wound up going to another friend of a friend's place. And the guy said, hey, check this out. And it was a red Stratocaster. And so I started strumming. Said, oh, this is the guitar in the dream. So it was like, okay. And then I dreamt about being in a, rather intimate situation with this girl I kind of half knew on the scene, but it was kind of, well, nothing's going to happen. And then again, by a random series of events, that's what happened. So I thought, okay, this stuff works. And so I just continued to write, copy the dreams down over time. And then the actual sort of trigger for writing the book was before COVID. It was 2019. I gave a talk about hypnagogia, which is the in-between state between sleeping and waking, which is actually partial to precognitive dreaming and events. Actually, it's one of the paranormal sort of parapsychological phenomena that are often associated with that in-between state. So I gave a talk about that, and to just flush it out a bit, I tacked on some accounts of precognitive dreams, Dunn's, and then my own. And I said, if you're interested in this, just do what I did. Just start writing your dreams down. And so somebody, like on Twitter the next day, or whatever it is now, I went on and I saw a post or a tweet from someone who had been at the talk. It was OMG and exclamation points, and it's true. And I don't quite remember how she managed to get all of this stuff into one tweet, but it was kind of like, I went to this thing, the guy said, write your dreams down and you'll see you dream the future, and it happened. And for her, she dreamt that she had picked up a hedgehog out of the road and put it on the pavement, or put it in the bushes or something like that, where it would be safe. And the very first thing she saw in her Twitter feed that morning was a post about how to protect the hedgehogs. So it's not exactly, she didn't exactly go and pick up a hedgehog, but I said to her, this is, your dream was subject to what I call symbolic distortion, because dreams speak in a symbolic language, although very often you'll get an exact, this is exactly what happened. It isn't, it really is exactly what happened. But sometimes it will be the same thing, very, 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 very close, but it'll be somehow communicated symbolically rather than, literally. And so when that happened, and not long after that, COVID hit, and we were all, stuck at home. And I just got in touch with my editor or my publishers, and I said, "Would you be interested in a book about?" I've been recording my precognitive dreams for about 40 years now, and it'd be nice to do something with them. So I said, "Yeah." So I wound up going through stacks of dream journals from about the early mid 80s up into very recently, and basically getting the best ones out. And I don't have I mean, and I also, I have chapters about those dreams. And one of the things that came to me is the ones we usually hear about are what I call the two Ds, is the disasters and the derbies. So you hear about the disaster dreams and then when somebody wins the races. But 95% of precognitive, I don't know if it in your case is true, but 95% of the precognitive material that I've experienced, and also in the literature about it that I've read, it's usually about everyday, you know, trivial, sorts of things. And by trivial, I'm not trying to, denigrate it, but it's just sort of everyday, the kind of dream that if it hadn't been precognitive, would be like, oh, well. And then you ask, like, why did I have a precognitive dream about that? And I have many, many examples in the book. And so, but yeah, but that's how I came to write about it.
Mm. Yes, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things to pick up there. It does tend to be your personal future rather than the future in general. So, but and actually, yes, I've had a number of experiences of them. As I think you say in the book, they tend to be one of the most common sort of paranormal, or at least apparently paranormal type experiences people have. So I actually had one a few days ago, and this was more of a hypnagogic one. But I was sort of lying. I just woken up and I was lying in bed in that sort of semi-sleepy state, and I suddenly started thinking about an 80s TV show called The Tripods, which in the first episode, this enormous alien tripod comes into a village, sort of looms above it, and it's sort of, and I thought, oh, I haven't thought about that for ages, and then didn't think of anything of it until I switched on the phone, and guess what the first image was on Facebook.
Was it exactly from the show?
Um,
Or a tripod, a big tripod or something?
yeah, pretty much. I mean, I wouldn't.
Right.
I'd say it was pretty. You were talking about these sort of symbolic distortions. I'd say wasn't absolutely identical, but it was the same scene that was illustrated in the
Yeah,
photo.
yeah. And yeah,
So,
this is the thing, and it's more time. It is your own future. So it's like a strip, cinema strip of your life, and you're getting some scenes. The editors kind of screwed things up, and he's sending you, or it's an avant-garde film, you know, last year at Marienbad or something like that. Whereas like
yeah.
things, all the time loops get mixed up and all that. But no, yeah, it's and it's more common. This is one of the things that Dunn himself said. I mean, he at first thought that he was suffering some weird, brain anomaly. Oh, what's happening? I'm in my life. It's jumping the queue. Or why is this happening? And then he, again, by accident, he overheard somebody else talking about the same thing, and then he realized that this was a, fairly common experience. And it's often, I would say, confused with deja vu, or it could be what we call deja vu, the French do, already seen, is rather than this, has this happened before? Oh, I dreamt this, but we don't think that. But I have to say myself, and I say in the book, to me, the deja vu feeling is different than the precognitive, what I call the precognitive tingle. Precognitive tingle to me is like, oh, bang, here, this is it.
Yeah.
Whereas deja vu it's a bit uncertain, and it's more of an uncertain, ambiguous feeling to me rather than the, oh God, yes, this is
Yeah.
it.
I mean, it's partly for the research for the book, but also because I've been talking to sort of skeptics this season. The cognitive psychology explanation is that it's really a coincidence. It's the law of large numbers, and that our brains are very good at seeking patterns. And the thing is, I that was why I was interested when you said in your book that there is a special sort of feeling to it, and that was exactly I thought I understand there are coincidences. There are dreams where it's a bit of a stretch, where it seems to be chance, but when it actually happens, it's almost too blatant. I can't put my finger on it, but there is a difference there somehow.
Hmm. Well, that to me is I always think of, I'm a naturalist. I'm not a hunter. I don't go out of my way looking for these things, but I pay attention to what's happening in the environment around me. And I had this kind of discussion with guy named I got to think Michael Sherman or Shermer. Sorry, my brain's Michael Shermer, I think it is. And um, there's something called the Institute of Art and Ideas, and they had it was at the Hay Festival a couple of years back, and they were doing stuff on kind of science and paranormal. There's Rupert Sheldrake was there talking with, and Ian McGilchrist was there talking with somebody, all that kind of thing. And I wound up, I did one thing with Ian McGilchrist, and I wound up doing something with this other fellow, and it was a discussion about, is experience subjective, or is it shared, or something like that. And got on to like shared dreams, and I said, well, I've had the experiences of shared dreams, and I've also had precognitive dreams. Or not. And he said, oh, well, I could understand how you might feel that you've had blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, 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 no. I didn't feel anything except the awe and mystery that came usually with the recognition that I just had another precognitive experience. And before that could get any further, the commentator shut it down. So that was like, so I hold no truck with these people who jump over backwards into fantastic dialectical, whatever, somersaults in order to explain something that plain and simple just happens. The world is such that these sorts of things happen. And I've been studying them in the wild, in situ, up here for 40 plus years now. And so, yeah, I had no compunction, no hesitation to say they are precognitive. They can't be, at least the ones I've had. And one of the ones I say in the book, to me, is the knockdown complete, TKO. I think it was 1992. I had a dream that a film made about this 1930s pulp magazine and radio program character, the Shadow, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. The shadow knows. So that's, and then when I was a kid, at least growing up in the States, there was all this sort of interest in pop culture from the 30s and 40s. So these shadow stories came out in paperbacks and all that. And so so I dreamt that there was a film about this, and there were two scenes in the dream. One of the shadow, the character, he had spent time in Tibet, so he had learned the power to cloud men's minds and all this kind of stuff. And so he can make himself two-dimensional and become an actual shadow and flit along the walls, like that. So in my dream, there was a scene where he's two-dimensional in the wall, and then he steps out. It becomes, three-dimensional. And then also in the dream, one of his trademarks, he had these twin 45 pistols. And in the dream, there was a scene where he has one of the guns, and it's like in front of a mirror, or a series of mirrors, like a prism, and it's reflected in many, many different images. Okay. And then there was also in the dream the plot of the movie. And the plot of the movie had to do with a sphere of some kind. Okay, so I think the dream was 1992. I think the actual film came out in 1994. I was living in Los Angeles. I was married at the time. And I saw the film. I said to my wife, because we discussed these sorts of things, she was interested in this sort of stuff too. And in the book, there's quite a few dreams where she and we kind of bounce back and forth, like sharing our dreams and, stuff like that. So in any case, I said, oh, remember that dream I told you about years ago? Here, I'll pull it out. I'll show in the journal. There it is. Let's go see the film and see what happens. So we go to the film, and two of the scenes I dreamt were exactly like that. You might say, okay, those are sort of trademark things, so they're going to turn up in any film about this character.
Mm.
But the actual film, the plot was about the bad guy. I don't remember his name. But there was this kind of nuclear device. I can't remember what sort of sphere it was, but it was a sphere. There was a something sphere. I forget what it exactly was, but it was going to destroy New York. So I just thought, well, 2 years in advance of this film coming out. It may have been in production when I had the dream 2 years before. It could have been in production then. Usually takes time to do the film. I don't know, but so perhaps it was telepathic. Perhaps I was picking up the stuff that was happening on the set wherever it was. But I'm just saying now that's one would have to go check when the film was in production to see what. But in any case, well, I can say, okay, I'll give you the two scenes from the film, but I dreamt the plot. I dreamt the plot of the film, and there's quite a few other uh, incidents in the book where it's about films we saw at the time.
Mm.
So I don't know. I mean, I'm but why? Why? I mean, well, I get the Jungian shadow was out of something, but that's kind of stretching it. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's a big question. Why do you have, not why does it happen in the sense of how could it possibly happen, but if these are meaningful events, you know,
Mm.
they're often just as they're saddled often with deja vu, they're often saddled with synchronicities. Uh,
Yes.
so even Jung, because Jung, but Jung just took synchronicity and there was this big stencil that he put over everything, and yeah, that covers it. That's like that explains all and it doesn't. That there is at least in my experience, there is a particular experience that is synchronicity, and it's a coincidence, but it's a meaningful coincidence. So there's coincidences, and then there's meaningful coincidences, and there are some that are so meaningful, it's like you're being hit over the head with something. Uh,
Mm.
and it feels like nothing other than somehow someone knows what I am thinking about at this moment and is something very, very important to me. And something exactly like that is out there in the world and has been arranged
Mm.
by whom, I don't know, for me to encounter. Because it's too much of a coincidence just to say, oh, well, it's just coincidence. Oh, yes, that would happen if you did. But, it's as if, yes, if you randomly walk down the street thousands of times, eventually you might, something in your head might coincide, but it isn't like that. I'm
No.
perfectly happy to accept that that may happen, but that's not the phenomenon we're talking about.
Mm.
This is the one time that happened, and that's what happened. So,
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, as far as, well, both of them are concerned, but synchronicities are concerned, in particular, I find that the really striking ones tend to happen when you're relaxed, usually when you're in a flow state. So for me, they're very definitely associated with the state of consciousness. It's the same with sort of psi or precognitive experiences, particularly. So, I mean, it was very interesting to read that you had a chapter on not just the dreaming state, but it was about the hypnagogia and the understanding that the ancients had, sort of the ancient Greeks and Egyptians had, but which has carried through really, at least on the margins to the present day, that dreams, these states of consciousness, they kind of open a door, don't they? So it's not just sort of garbage from your
well, I
brain.
mean, that's like, oh, yeah, that's what the scientists, whoever you want to call them, that's what they say. It's just rubbish. You're just clearing your data banks, and it's just no. It's because all you have to do is pay a bit of attention. And you see there's some intelligence at work there. There's some intelligence at work in the dreams, just the same intelligence I would say that's at work in synchronicities, or you might call it the induced synchronicity of when you practice something like the I Ching, or
Yeah,
which to me that's the one divinatory kind of practice that I've maintained for years now. I mean, ages ago I tried tarot and stuff like that, but what I found with the I Ching is that the answers are like, that's it, bang, don't bother me. And if you ask twice, and as they say in the book, if you ask twice, you will get Meng, youthful folly, which basically says, look, you can ask me once, but if you ask me twice the same question, that's, forget it. And
yeah,
that's happened to me enough times where, like anybody else, you're when you're the best time to throw the I Ching is when you're relaxed and everything's okay in a certain way. But then lots of times we tend to do it if we're in stressful. Oh, what should I do? What should I do? And I've done that enough times, and then not what do you mean? That doesn't help me. Give me, and it's
yeah,
like, hey, I told you, and then you
yeah.
think, okay, who, who? Not even what, but who? Who? Because and only a who sort of can answer you. A what can't.
Mm.
but that somehow some intelligence knows that you've asked the same question twice, and the saying, forget it, I've given you the answer, don't bother me. So there's an intelligence at work at that. That's the same intelligence that arranges synchronicities. And I have to anthropomorphize and say arrange, because these things seem orchestrated, and
Mm.
that's the meaning content. That's the background to it being meaningful in some way, and then the intelligence you have in dreams, where again
Yes.
they speak in a symbolic language. One of the things that runs through practically all ancient accounts of dreams is that they have a sense of humor. They're funny, and oftentimes it's a real dumb kind of sense of humor. Where it's like, oh, that's the joke, and then you see, and oh my God, it's as simple as that. Because I think sometimes we come up to them a little too sophisticated, archetype hunting or whatever it might be. When if you can kind of look at it as a story, or kind of something like that, because they have it, obviously they have a narrative. There's a beginning, middle, and end in some way. So Jung talks about that. There's a certain kind of narrative, direction. So if you just take it as that, what's the story? What's the story? I mean, I'm no master at it myself, but I think in general, one, yourself, you're the worst possible person to interpret your dreams, because it's coming from your unconscious. It's stuff that you don't know about. Someone else who could be a bit more objective can look at you and say, "Ah, I see that." But sometimes
Yeah.
they are so straightforward, where if you're able to see the simple thing that they're trying to say, it's like, oh God, here I am trying to figure it out in all this other way, and it's really something simple as that, and it tends to be in a kind of joke.
Mm. Yes, yes. You mentioned dream yoga, and actually, a few years ago, I probably should have another go. Actually, I had a go at doing some, not very well, but the book basically said it was by a Bowen practitioner from Tibetan,
Mm,
and he was talking about the difference between what they call samsaric dreams, so that samsara, the sort of wheel of delusion that we all live in, and sort of dreams that point to enlightenment.
mm,
So with samsaric dreams, quite often you're just it might be those dreams where you have everyday worries and you just end,
yeah,
or whatever you've been has been milling around in your head. But then there are dreams of a different character which point you to the clear light, and that reminded me very much of something you mentioned actually, which is the gate of horn and ivory, which is in the Odyssey, isn't it? So
mm,
I always get it the wrong way around. Which one has dreams that tell you truth, and the other is
yeah.
basically garbage. Is it the horn
Yeah.
one that's the,
Oh, I don't have it in front of me right now, so um, uh,
I think the ivory ones are fakes, isn't it?
yeah, I say it kind of I would say that I don't know why, maybe Tower of Ivory sort of thing, I don't know, but yeah, I mean there is yeah there is all that. And well, again, it's sort of what Dunn was saying too, because in a sense, okay, you have lots of things mixed up in that state. So you have the past. There's often stuff, or dreams often stuff in the past, or as a muddled account of what's happening now, in which you could have bits and pieces of the future down the line. Um, but I know in the dream yoga, it's also they're basically aiming at training you to have lucid dreams, so you could able to become awake in the dream state, and then when you awake in that dream state, then recognize, well, this is just another dream state, the state we're in now, different states of consciousness, which I guess in different traditions, that's in Gurdjieff tradition, that's the case as well, and it's certain things. So, but I understand it's like they don't really have the message idea. It's not like it's not a message from anything. It's the kind of delusion or Maya or something that you experience in everyday life, and that you'll experience when you're dying, when you're
Mm.
going to the bardo and all that kind of thing. So I think that's one of the differences, say, between someone like Jung or others like that. But what I found at times, I know there were times in my life, doesn't happen that much now, but there were times when the waking and dream states seemed to be blending, when I was having quite a few precognitive experiences at the same time, or what I call the synchronicity cloud, where it seemed to be a lot. So I do, I'd have to really think, okay, what was happening then? Because that's quite some time ago now. But I just remember that happening, where there'd be quite a few in a row in a week or two, and then like the next week some more, and you'd feel there was some. I don't know. Maybe it's because you're young. Maybe it's because I was very very interested at the time. And I mean, one of the things too is like Jung says, if you pay attention to the unconscious, it'll pay attention to you. So if you start saying, "Oh, you're interested in that sort of thing," well, here's some more, and it could very well be that it may not be the case that the sort of, say, archetypes and stuff that Jung discovered. I'm not saying this is the case, but it could be the case. It's not so much that you discovered them, is that he had a very, very, what do you want to say, generous unconscious who said, "Oh, you like that sort of thing." Well, because one of the people I talk about in the book is the Russian philosopher P.D. Uspensky, who's most known for being a follower of Gurdjieff. But early in his career, he wrote quite a bit about dreams, and he explored the hypnagogic state quite a bit. And in his book New Model of the Universe, which is a great collection of essays on various different sort of metaphysical and esoteric topics, he talks about the dream artist in his experiences of maintaining the hypnagogic state, which he did waking up in the morning rather than going to sleep at night. And if you want to try to practice this, it's better if you can do it early in the morning, waking up, rather than falling into sleep. Because until you get it down, more times you just have a bad night's sleep. So if you can set your alarm clock a little bit earlier, or whatever it is, in the morning, so wake you up a little, then drift back into sleep, and you can see dreams starting. But he talks about the dream artist and this incredible. And all of us, we have these experiences where the dreams are so incredibly real. I mean, they're more real than real.
Yes.
They're more real than anything HD or VR or anything like that. It can even come close to. I mean, they have what I call the crackle of reality. It's like, when you pick up a dry leaf and you go like that, and it's like, yeah.
Yep.
In the dream, it's all of that stuff. And like, well, who is doing that? And it can't just be junk, because it's not junk. You know what I'm saying? If it was junk, it'd just be random. Why would it take these narrative sorts of forms? And why would it have this kind of crystal clarity and poignancy sometimes? I know I've had dreams, so I've come out of them knowing that in the dream I've had a sort of emotional experience that I rarely have, in waking life, with a painful poignancy about it. So how could that be junk? So but what is it that's happening in the dreams that we're able to be this fantastic creators, and more times 9 times out of 10 our own lives were kind of duds, so myself included. Yeah. So like, why do we have this capacity there that only somehow works then?
Well, I mean, there are some current ideas of consciousness that basically we're experiencing a constrained dream all of the time, so that when you go to bed at night, your brain sort of goes into overdrive because there's no sensory experience to anchor it. So, but again, I think there's something to that, very definitely. But at the same time, I've also noticed there seems to be this eagerness to drain any kind of experience of any significance whatsoever, except for sort of the cognitive mechanisms, which so I don't think the brain theories are necessarily wrong. I just think they're incomplete. Now, one of the things you do in the book is link this capacity for precognitive dreams with faculty X, which was a key concept of Colin Wilson. So could you explain a tiny bit about who Colin Wilson was and why he was interested in faculty X?
Colin Wilson, he died in 2013, and he came to fame in the mid-1950s with his first book, The Outsider, when he was 24. And it's a study of kind of creative individuals, and the pressures and tensions, mental stresses of seeking meaning in a time when it, as you're saying now, it's leached and drained out, and something that's not available anymore. And the book was a bestseller, and then there was a kind of critical backlash to him, and he kind of went undercover for a long time, but he continued to write, and then he came back with another bestseller, a book I mentioned earlier called The Occult, and I think it came out in 1971. And it was this fantastically readable, credible, well researched his history, going back to ancient shamans and up into contemporary times, of magic and the occult, but in the context of philosophy and psychology and literature and history. So it wasn't just the book of spells and black magic. And Wilson had this whole history behind him of writing about existentialism and phenomenology and philosophy and all this kind of stuff. So it's in that kind of context, but a page turner. So not academic at all, like a exciting. I read this. I'm saying I read this book when I was living on the Bowery in New York 50 years ago. Debbie Herring was a block away from CBGB. So Punk Central, and reading about wow, and Faculty X. X just means we don't have a name for this particular ability we have. And it's what he calls, to be able to grasp the reality of other times and places, not just the fact. You can say, well, what do you mean the reality? Oh, yeah, I know what I did 10 years ago. I was doing that. But you know the facts of that. But if something, the taste of something, a smell, a tune, something reminds you very vividly of this past time, then it's a totally other kind of memory where you're actually living it again. And the classic example comes from the novel Remembrance of Things Past, this huge multi-volume work by
Oh
the
yeah.
French writer Marcel Proust. At the beginning of the book, the main character, he tastes a madeleine, which is this little kind of biscuit, the French have, and it had been dipped into an herbal tea, so a matcha these days or whatever it is, and he tastes it, and suddenly he had this fantastic sensation of being taken out of time. And he couldn't quite grasp it at first. And then he realized when he was a child, on the holidays, an aunt of his used to give him a taste of one of these biscuits dipped in her tisane, her herbal tea. And so he recaptured the past. Again, not he knew that he did that when he was a kid. If you asked him, oh, what did you do? You were 9 years old and you visited, oh, you blah, blah, blah. Then the reality of it came back. So this is Faculty X. And it's not really about the reality of the past, it's about the reality of the present. In fact, the next book I'm working on, the working title is that We Forget That We Exist. And it's based on experience of Faculty X I had during the lockdown. And I'll just tell the story very quickly. Whereas one early spring morning here, when I have a garden here, and I went out the back door into the garden, I had a cup of coffee, and I looked up and I said, "What's that?" I was completely surprised, and it was the sun. And I know the sun doesn't come out that often here in gray old England, but it was like I didn't know what it was first for a couple seconds, and it was as if I'd seen it for the first time. But of course, I know exactly what. So all the knowledge of it came back to me quickly. But that immediate thing was like, and that was like this primal perception of raw reality before all the concepts get in. And most of the time, we see the whole world, oral experience, through these concepts. And we need to, because they organize the world around us. The world is, again, one of the effects, I believe, of taking psychedelic, substances and other things like that is you have a kind of thing like, what is that? Suddenly, what you thought you knew suddenly becomes mysterious and radiant of some strange meaning that hitherto you were ignorant of. So there's descriptions of this faculty experience that Wilson writes about in quite a few of his books. I mentioned the Proust one. One of the other famous ones was by the historian Arnold Toynbee, and who wrote this massive multi-volume work, Study of History. It's one of those things that if you ever do go to the deserted island, you want to take that with you, because that'll occupy you for quite a few years reading it, and you won't be disturbed. So, but he tells the story of when, I guess it was about 1912 or something like that. So more than 100 years ago, but he was in Greece, and he was overlooking the site of an ancient city called Mistra that was a ruin. It had been a ruin for like a century or something like that. And if you know some Greek history, it was very important kind of city. And while he was on this site overlooking the ruins, and he was relaxing, as you were saying earlier, and he even talks that he was munching on a chocolate bar or something like that. Suddenly, this kind of invasion by these wild Northern Highlanders that left the city decimated. He was in it, So he knew of it. He knew the history intellectually. So he knew the facts. But then somehow being on the site and then being this relaxed state he was in, the reality of it came back to him. And then Toynbee talks about other kinds of experiences like that, and even talks about one where he was by Victoria Station, here in London, and it was like just walking down the road, and he had a vision of all of history, like a great panorama of it. So in that case, it wasn't only his own personal past, like Proust. He goes back to his childhood. This was something where it's like he was up. And again, it makes sense. In one sense, Proust is a writer. He's thinking about his own life. He wants to write a novel about his life and this kind of thing. And Toynbee is a historian. So it's not about him personally so much, but it's about, this wider vision that he had. And the more I read about these accounts, I felt like I've had experiences like that where I felt like, I don't know how to say it. I mean, how I try to describe it now when I write about it, is that we can know something, and then you can really know it, or you can know it in italics.
Yep.
You can know it that way. And one of the problems is we don't have a language to talk about these sorts of experiences. When we say we know something, it's like, well, book learning, or it's a fact or something like that, and then you really know. You really know. I mean, but the ancient Greeks, they had a knowing. There's something they call episteme, which is the knowledge of facts and study and experiment and learning, and the philosophical pursuit of epistemology comes out of that. How we know what we know. And then there's something they call gnosis,
Yeah.
which is a more direct, immediate kind of unfiltered knowledge of reality, and this is associated with the early Greek, the early Christian sects that were called Gnostics. As opposed to
Yes.
the Petrine Church, the church that we know now, but they were this early group because they believed that they had this kind of experience, and it was not about dogma, and it wasn't about faith. It was about knowledge and experience, and the church didn't care for that. And so there's a whole history in the church itself. There's the Bogomils and the Cathars, and the different times, different Christian sects have come up that have pursued the same sorts of things that the early Gnostics did. And again, Jung considered himself a kind of Gnostic, not in the sense that he followed the edicts of the ancient sects, but that his own pursuit was a kind of inner knowledge. And so some cultures, or some schools of thought, do recognize this sort of different ways of knowing, but we don't,
Hmm.
or not in the official kind of language.
No. I think the closest that we come to it is via the works of humanistic psychologists like Abraham Maslow, who Wilson was very interested in. So I for this video, as well as looking at his books, I reviewed, there's an LP he did called The Essential Colin Wilson, which is on YouTube. So he spends the first half of that talking about the peak experience and Abraham Maslow. So could you explain a little bit about that, but also
Mm-hmm.
why the Toynbee experience seems to be more intense than the basic peak experience, doesn't it? So it's like a spectrum.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Maslow did a remarkable thing in the mid 20th century. He decided to study healthy people rather than to study sick people, because all the psychology up to then is based on the study of sick people, or abnormal psychology. There was no notion of normal psychology was well adjusted, you fit into society, whatever. And then he got and he was a strict clinical academic. He wasn't like Freud. He wasn't see. Or he did see some, but he wasn't like Freud. Seeing patients and all that kind of stuff. And he decided to start studying healthy people. And so he knew some people in his department at the university he was at, and that sort of thing. And one of the things he discovered was that a lot of healthy, sort of highly motivated, driven, engaged people, they tend to have these sorts of experiences of some kind of unsolicited, spontaneous joy and delight, usually about something that part of their everyday experience. And I think this is something that some people who have been critical of Maslow, like the post-Jungian James Hellman, I don't know if you know his work, archetypal
Yes.
psychology. he's kind of fascinated with melancholia and depression and stuff like that. And he always said, "Oh, Maslow always he's always running after these peak experiences." No, he never ran after peak experiences, and none of the people he studied ran after them. They weren't like jumping out of parachuting out of planes or climbing Everest. They're everyday people. But suddenly something, that part of their everyday life, struck them immediately, and it just filled them with kind of delight and joy. A mother getting her children and husband ready to get out the door, to work and to school, this everyday kind of thing. So this one story was the sunlight came to the window and suddenly she had this spontaneous sense of how happy she was. It's the same thing with Proust. It's the same thing. Oh yeah, I knew I used to get that biscuit with my, oh, that's the biscuit I used to get. That's the difference. He tells the story of a Marine who was like wherever out there for a year and a half, and he's sent back to home base on an island, and there's some nurses there, and he hadn't seen a woman in a year and a half, and he said, women are different than men. I guess I can say that. Sorry, but so it's this kind of stuff where it's like an everyday thing you suddenly see from a different angle, and you realize it's its value. What do you want to say? You suddenly, something that you took for granted, you suddenly see its importance. So this is something that happened, to people that were motivated, self-driven, and all that kind of stuff. And then he developed what he called the hierarchy of needs, which is well known. It's a kind of, the very base. The first humans are motivated to fulfill certain needs, and the basic needs, for food. So if you I guess breathing probably be even more basic, but we can't eat. You don't have that for 2 minutes, forget it. Right. So if you need food and water, then shelter, place to live,
Yeah.
cubbyhole of your own, then some kind of relationship, some sort of love relationship, could, with another human, or could be with a pet, something like that. Then some kind of recognition from the community you're in, self-esteem. And then beyond that, he said there was what he called the self-actualization level. And this was a need that's no longer what he called a deficiency need. The first four are deficiency needs. These are things we lack, and we have to have them. But once they're all fulfilled, we have a need to express ourselves. We have a need to be creative. We have a need to sort of use our abilities and all that kind of stuff. And that's the self-actualization. So this is remarkable. They're saying like, well, healthy people are actually, and he came to the conclusion that what we generally consider to be healthy, just adjustment to normal society, is actually sub-normal.
Yes.
According to these needs, because
Yes.
self-actualization is beyond that. It's not about that, and it's not about so these people, once all these other needs are fulfilled, they're often they spend a lot of time alone, and we're interested in what's going on inside themselves and what's going on outside the world. So it's a very different kind of thing. And Wilson recognized this, and actually Maslow read one of Wilson's books, a book called the British title was The Age of Defeat. In the States, it was called The Stature of Man. And it's the short book that Wilson wrote about the loss of the hero in contemporary literature. It's all about the kind of death of a salesman. It's all about the average person and a variety of things like that. So the other directed, people, what is everybody else doing? So the characters are all like that. And what's happened to the individual who's, aiming to self-actualize and things. So they got into a correspondence. And so this was something that, I mean, when I came across this idea, I realized, I've had experiences like that. I remember one when I was on tour. I've been in this memoir recently, and I've been going over some of these things. And I was first here in the UK with Blondie in 1977. And we played in Bournemouth, down on the coast, which I didn't know it was north of nowhere. I had no idea, where this was. And I remember we drove out from London in the van, and we got there at night. I had no idea where we were, and I got up early the next day and just went out for a walk. So I didn't know the English Channel was like, just around the corner. So wherever I was, I turned a corner and went down some lane, and it opened up, and suddenly it was like, there's the English Channel and bright blue sky with clouds. And I was like, oh, I'm in England. Oh, that's the English Channel. That's France is over there, and the rest of Europe. And I suddenly had that expansive, moment. And it sounds kind of cliched and corny, but it really was like that. And it was like, it wasn't mystical in the sense of supernatural. It just was this tremendous opening.
Yes.
Opening up and widening of what, reality is usually that, whatever's like two,
Sort of
2
restricted.
feet right in front of you or whatever, if you're lucky, not 6 inches really. And then suddenly it was like, ooh, it expanded
Yes.
for 2 seconds or something. And then, so, yeah. And then subsequent, I just said, okay, yeah, that's like what those guys are writing about.
So yes, I mean, I've had, well, I think everyone has these at times. I tend to be very prone to have them in the natural world. So for me, don't get me wrong, I really enjoy, cities and everything, but I find if particularly if you're in places like suburbs or inside too much, it seems to shut this stuff down. But I mean, one particularly striking one, I was actually on walking back from Everest Base Camp, and we're walking towards this village, and there's this really beautiful, vast mountain called Amadablan, sort of snowy peak, and I was walking towards it really tired, and then suddenly I looked up and saw this glorious sort of snow-bound peak, but like Nicholas Rorich's paintings. I know you've written about him too, but it really just suddenly, bang, this real sense of expansion. And the interesting thing that I found Wilson talking about these things is that when you're in that state, you think this is more real. This is the real reality. But then when you fall out of that, perhaps into, you're a bit fatigued or maybe mildly depressed or whatever, suddenly you forget that it's reality.
Mm, yeah.
You don't hold on to it.
Well, this is what Wilson says. What we have to do is be able to firmly grip the fact that it is real, and we don't have to see it all the time, right? It's like anything else. It's like, it's the same thing. I've not been to Everest, but I know the snowy peaks there, so I know they're there. And if I could imagine, what it would have been like to have done that enough for me to have had not the same experience you had, but an imaginative reproduction of it, or simulation of it in my own. So then I could, oh yeah, I don't know exactly what it's like, but I can imagine. That's what he says. The imagination. See, one of the things, like these outsider characters, so many of them, because they felt that claustrophobic sense, that suffocating sense of, here I am trapped again. And I know it's like on top of the mountain peak. I know what it's like. And so they went out and did crazy things. That's why Wilson said crisis is the one way, or one way we can throw off what he calls the robot. The robot is the one that, despite our best efforts, soon enough will be the one looking at the mountain. Soon enough we'll be listening to Mozart. Soon enough, and the robot is something that's absolutely necessary. It's an evolutionary labor-saving device we've developed in order to take care of all the everyday sorts of things, so that we can think about higher things. So, perfect example, I had to learn how to type. And when you first learn how to type, you have to, where do I go? All your concentration is on where you put your fingers, one after the other, until one day, lo and behold, bang, you can type. So you don't have to think where to put my finger, because if you do that now, you'll type badly. You'll interfere with the robot who's doing it for you. But you can think, oh, what do I want to type? What do I want to post? What do I want to say? Whatever it is. So that's a higher level, work. So there's the bottom level work, the actual mechanics of being able to type, and then what you want to type. So the robot's absolutely necessary, but he does his job too well. That's the problem. He takes over too many functions. Okay. But the peak experience, Faculty X, all these things, you can say there are all moments when, for whatever reason, the robot is not doing it. You're doing it. You are there. It's the same thing I say when Gurdjieff talks about self-remembering. So I just think these are different names for gradients of the same sort of experience. So Faculty X, peak experience, self-remembering. At least in terms of my own experience, because I know when I first came across the notion of self-remembering, Uspensky writes about this. This is part of the Gurdjieff teaching. The notion that we don't remember that we exist. We think we remember, but we really don't. Most of the time, we're automatic and mechanical. But he said there's a certain feeling that comes over us sometimes when we find ourselves in a strange place. If you're traveling and you think, oh, what, me here? Wherever it might be, you're in a square in Prague and you've never been there before, and suddenly just like I had that moment looking at this channel, but everybody lives in Bournemouth. It's like, yeah, we see it every day, mate. For me, at that moment when I saw it, it was like, what, me here? So it's the, should we say, somehow oddness, the strangeness of where you are throws off the robot for, momentarily.
Mm.
And that's why we enjoy holidays. But this Wilson said the crisis, inconvenience, some kind of um, threat to us can often be something that throws that off. And he talks about, Sartre saying that he never felt as free as when he was working with the French underground during the occupation, and the Gestapo could have arrested him. And he talks about Graham Greene going up to Berkhamsted Common with the pistol, and because he's so bored to tears, he can't think of anything better to do, play Russian roulette. And when he doesn't blow his brains out, suddenly everything around him is absolutely dripping and soaking with meaning. Whereas like
Mm.
30 seconds before, it meant nothing. So what happened? What happened to Green? Because nothing out there changed. Something happened to him. And Colin said the threat, it's like you make involuntarily, the mind makes a fist. And that's what we sort of have to learn how to do. Most it's like, some kind of limp handshake kind of thing. It's like, oh no. And that was like a Colin thing I just did. I remember him doing that at talks when I used to see him give talks here in London and all that. So yeah, so is there a way for us to learn how to use the imagination to induce that kind of concentration that the threat or the crisis induces in us? Because, it's kind of silly to think we have to, put a gun to our heads in order to enjoy life.
Yes, well, 100%. I mean, but I think this is a big reason what we're talking about, basically, this sort of, I think he quotes Chesterton, it's absurd good news.
Mm.
It's a big reason why I liked Colin Wilson's work in the first place, because I think, like you, the first book that I read of his was the Occult. It was in the library. And then someone said, well, have you read The Outsider? So I got to The Outsider, and I found out David Bowie liked The Outsider as well and did an album about that. And then he wrote a short book called Super Consciousness, which was a summary of a lot of it. And the reason why I liked it was that we can talk about this in a moment, but a lot of the sort of official thinkers of our culture don't see the world in that way, and there's this undercurrent, particularly in, say, pop science, that basically we live in a completely pointless universe. Our lives are meaningless. We're robots, and imagine the most depressing worldview you can have, and that's the philosophy that's favoured. So you've got to be clear that it's all global. The thing is, in saying this, I'm not saying that I didn't like the science, because I love science. I'm fascinated by it, but it always seemed to me that when you you turn to the philosophy, writers like Colin Wilson were a lot more inspiring and true to my experience as well, because I thought, I know that the universe is pointless. I know that's not true because I've had these experiences.
I know, I completely agree with you. And I think one of the things is, like, you often have these, wonderful science documentaries, the wonders and marvels and mysteries, whatever, Brian Cox or somebody else, and they're just breathless about this and black holes, but not one of them ever mentions what you just said. And in the end, our calculations tell us that, well, it's like Steven Weinberg.
Yeah.
Out for some time now, first 3 minutes, but he says, paraphrasing, something along these lines, the more the universe seems, the more we can comprehend the universe, the more it seems pointless.
Yeah.
And I often say, well, maybe you stuck around longer than the first 3 minutes, Stephen. You might have seen something that about it, but it's like, and anyone who does good science, but says actually that doesn't have to be the case. Rupert Sheldrake, Ian McGilchrist, in terms of neuroscience, and no. It's the horrible thing. You're bringing God and religion in the back door, which they're not doing at all. And the whole thing is, there's been a whole, what's going to say, loyal opposition to hold this kind of meaningless universe thing forever, going back, God, Samuel Butler,
Yeah.
Erewhon,
Yes.
In The Way of All Flesh, he wrote these anti-Darwinian
Yes.
books, or at least critical of the neo-Darwinism that is more or less what Hawking's and everybody else is based on. And he said, that Darwin had banned mind from the universe. But there's life in habit, and I forget there's some others where he brings up all these anomalies, all these different things that, okay, if you go along strict Darwinian theory, how do you explain that? And you can't. How do you explain that? And the whole idea is
Mm.
like, this is what Rupert Sheldrake says, promissory notes. Oh, well, we'll get around to that one day. Just trust us. And here's our IOU. And at some point, and it's like, but the thing is, if you don't have that, what are you going to put in your place? All the wacko stuff that you see on QAnon, all the stuff that's actually
Yeah,
seems to be becoming, mainstream ideology in the new America. It's happening now, all this
yeah, yeah,
change. It's like, which reminds me of nothing so much as, and I know it's cliched now, but in the Germany of National Socialism, they had all these
yeah,
strange ideas, the Hollow Earth, the Herbinger's idea that, the stars are really great chunks of ice out there, and it was what was called in a book came out ages ago called The Morning of Magicians, the
mm,
absolute elsewhere. And it strikes me that America's, sliding very quickly into that kind of realm. But I'm saying it's all well, okay, so we don't want that, so we have to stay strict. But if you say with the strict kind of very rigorous rationalist, reductive, no nonsense science, you end up with a completely and what motivates you to explore? If everything is meaningless, why bother? It's sort of one of the people is not a scientist, but he's a social philosopher, the fellow John Gray.
mm.
He's written lots of books about how human beings are really kind of a blight on the planet, and it's absolutely ridiculous for us to think that we can plan for the future because microbiology and germs and all this other stuff. Blah, blah, blah. And I want to say to him, well, John, why are you writing your books? If we have absolutely no control over the future and we can't do anything, why bother? Why don't you just go on holiday? You must have made enough money already to just go enjoy yourself. But so the fact that you keep writing these books means for some you don't actually buy what you're saying because you
Mm.
still think it's meaningful for you to write these books. And I think, well, it's
Mm.
meaningful to do that, and it's meaningful to do lots of other stuff. But it is this kind of misanthropic notion. It's
Yes.
terrible. Oh yes, yeah. It's as if I always think it's sort of like, okay, the idea is like, well, we don't need to have that. I can understand why you would need to feel this, just like the fellow said. I can understand why you would feel that you had precognitive dreams, and they're making allowances, but yes, we're a bit more tougher stuff here, and we don't need that kind of stuff. And I want to say, no, you actually have a desperate need to show how tough you are, and how masochistic you could be, and how many cold showers you can take, and you know what I mean. It's like this just to me is a kind of um, I don't know what you want to call it. It's a kind of flexing of muscles and showing that we're really tough. We don't need that kind of stuff. But that's no argument. And the whole argument that, oh, because I perceive meaning in the universe, that means I need it. No, I perceive the meaning. You need not to see the meaning. You know what I mean? So it's just, but they somehow have the upper hand. So there's a kind of implicit acceptance that, yeah, that must be closer to the truth because it shaves off everything that might make us happy.
Mm.
But
Yes,
why does
absolutely.
the truth? Why does the truth have to be miserable? It's like
What is the truth?
it just there's no need for it to be
Well,
that. I just don't understand. Like, why is that?
absolutely. I mean, what I tend to do is separate out that sort of rather gloomy. I don't know. I never find a quite satisfactory term for it. Sort of scientific materialism is what
Mm,
Rupert Sheldrake calls it. But then there are the facts of science. So, for example, I mean, I, I helped teach an evolution course when I was back in Sussex. I was fascinated by that and deep time, the whole story of life on Earth, from
mm,
the first cells through the dinosaurs
mm.
and all of that stuff. I find that awe-inspiringly amazing. I love going to the Natural History Museum and seeing the fossils and
Mm.
and all of that stuff. But then, you go to the bookshop in the Natural History Museum. The first book you pick up says, "Oh, well, it's all pointless." So I tend to separate out those sort of scientific facts, if you like, from this
Mm.
depressing philosophy. And I think what disturbs me a little, you mentioned John Gray, because I know, we mentioned you do a critique of him in Caretakers of the Cosmos,
All
another
right.
of your
Yeah.
books. But I've read, and the number of people I've read or talked to who just take that philosophy of his for granted. So I was reading this, I can't remember who it was, but this article of this philosopher. It's a pop article, and she was saying, "Oh, I go to John Gray when I want to be realistic about things, and I want to see how things are." And I think they've just completely swallowed.
No, no, I agree. I mean, and again, his vision actually, saying the book is like not that far away from that of Marquis de Sade. If he took it seriously, if he actually said, "Okay, this is what it's really like," then you can't argue against the Marquis de Sade saying, "Well, just do what you want to do. Enjoy whatever you want to enjoy. There's no moral law stopping you from doing it. There's consequences. It's socially inconvenient for you to pursue your passions and do what you want. We acknowledge that, but." It's just hypocritical to say that it's evil to do it because there's no good, there's no evil, there's just microbes or sand
Yeah,
drifting. It's like one of the an older sort of philosopher like this, or scientific thinker, Jacques Monod, French, and he wrote a book called Chance and Necessity.
oh yes, yeah,
Everything was just that. That's we
very
have to accept,
depressing.
and the French love that kind of stuff. We have to accept the thing is, but it says, no, I don't. I don't. Why? I see no compelling reason other than somehow you making me feel sheepish about thinking that actually
Mm.
there is a meaning, and not even like there is a meaning, but like, well, okay, I don't accept what you're saying. And I don't accept the religious, traditional religious thing, but I've had these experiences. They are just as much a part of my life as everything else. And a good phenomenologist would just accept them as, okay, this is more phenomena happening. And
Yeah.
descriptive analysis of the phenomena without judging it, without saying, oh, this can't happen, without explaining it. And the urge behind so much of this stuff is to explain away. Oh, it's what Jung said, the nothing but
Yes,
years
100%.
ago, or Arthur Kessler, who nobody reads anymore, but I would suggest they do, and Ghost in the Machine and Act of Creation, and books like that in the 60s. He says, we can't have an anthropomorphic world, but we can have a ratomorphic one, in which that human beings' motivations can be explained in terms of the behavior of rats in mazes. So yeah,
Yep.
we're just sophisticated rats rather than like, oh, actually we're motivated by something other. But there's the
Yep.
it's what it is. But
Mm.
there must be some kind of law. Okay, yes, it's cleaner, it's simpler if you can find one simple thing to answer all that stuff, and that's the beauty of it in some way. But then you lose all that stuff, and it's like the famous conversation Freud and Jung had, where Freud was going on about how, culture, religion, all of this stuff, art, it's all, uh, sublimated sexuality. That's what it all is behind it, you know. And Jung, is nodding his head, listening, but uh, professor, but if that's true, that means that all the great ideals and basically Beethoven and Goethe and it's just running.
I
Yes,
say,
yes, so yes, this is true, but this is the great burden that we have to carry. It's like, well, what? How
why?
arrogant? How arrogant can you be? We are the tough one. We're the one strong enough to recognize that this, and Jung realize, well, this is just nutty. This can't be the case.
Yeah.
And and Maslow the same thing. It can't be what he would call our higher needs are just as instinctoid as our lower needs. Just as much as we have a hunger, we have a need to eat, we have a need to, we have a sexual appetite. We want the self-esteem, we want everybody to like our tweets or posts and
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And I would say tangentially, I think socially, we reached the level of the self-esteem level on Maslow's, culturally, Maslow's hierarchy, in the sense that, social media, where we're just, everyone's concerned about everybody else, whether they're liking your posts or not. But the higher needs, what he calls meta needs, the need to self-actualize, the need to know, the need to pursue ideals, the real need for real love, not solely sexual. These are just much
Mm.
part of our biological equipment, inheritance, as anything else is. So there's no need to reduce them. But and once you do that, it's like, oh no, you're letting in the door this little stuff that we can't quantify. No,
Mm.
it's and I would think this is one of the problems that we're facing in the West these days is,
Yeah.
the fact that, okay, you can pursue pursuit of happiness, pursue whatever you want. We're not going to give you any guidelines what you should pursue because there aren't any. you're free to do what you want.
Yeah.
And then once you realize that, okay, whatever it might be, and sensual delights, money, power, all the usual things, once they're kind of, used up, you're still there twiddling your thumb thinking, what's this all about? There's nothing. There's nothing. And I would say one of the things that's happening in America now is the current administration has provided and will provide that sense of meaning to those people who are behind him.
Yeah,
But it's
but
make America great again. This is a great mythic kind of,
it's a fake though. I mean,
yeah,
because
yeah, it's up. Yeah, I'm sorry, go.
Aldous Huxley wrote an essay about this. I think it's called Beliefs, and it's in
Mm,
tagged on the end of one of the editions of the Perennial Philosophy. And he was basically looking at the 20s. So in the 20s, in the wake of the First World War, this philosophy of meaninglessness took hold, and it was partly the trauma, I think. But he suggested that what happened was that people didn't just become sort of atheists or whatever. They started desperately searching around for alternative ways of finding meaning.
mm,
And one of the solutions they found was totalitarianism. So Nazism and Stalinism and all of those extreme totalitarian beliefs he believed were because people had lost touch with this basic
mm,
spiritual sense
mm,
of
mm,
the aliveness of the world.
No, I agree, and I say this book I did on Trump a couple of years ago, Dark Star Rising, and this is one of the questions that the left, brilliant intellectual columnists, they never bring up because it's like it's the existential factor. That's what he's doing. I mean, well, it's a bogus meaning, but it's the same thing. Like if you're hungry, you can go to McDonald's, you can go to a health food shop,
Yes.
whatever. You'll get fed at McDonald's and you'll be full, and it's whatever. So it's not as healthy as something else that's more nutritious, but it'll satisfy that need, and that's the thing. And the, the opposition didn't really have anything like that except for special interest groups who sort of squabbled among themselves, different, whatever you want to call it, different progressive sort of
Mm.
groups. And but with the right, they just like, here, you are part of this big thing that's happening now, and yes, you're gonna be great again, and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that's this I it's sad, but it's an existential reality that we're not, whatever you want to call it, the purely rational scientific kind of thing just doesn't satisfy us, in the sense of like, well, yeah, this is the facts, this is what it's like, and yeah, you can go do what you want, and but it all comes down to this, where it's like, no, we all, just like people like to go to their football, their footy, and I mean, they are one with their team, and they feel the triumph and they feel the tragedy, and they go home on the way home and they're still feel, it's like it's a religious experience, and
It is.
and that's what he's using. That's what he's providing. I mean,
Yeah,
corrupt as it is, but that's what he's providing.
100%. I mean, I think I remember reading the reports of Madison Square, and although the sort of various offensive things people were saying were highlighted, I had a chat with my brother, and he was saying, well, other people who were there were reporting this sort of feeling of being welcome and this sense of fun and belonging. And I think when I look at sort of
That's what
say
people said at Jamestown.
yeah, yeah,
Well,
that's it. The love bombing though is part of totalitarianism, isn't it?
yeah.
I mean, it's and sort of cults, but the I think you're right actually about the sort of progressive left. I've seen a big doubling down on sort of very crude sort of scientific rationalism, which includes this pointless universe. And I agree. I think until that aspect, the existential aspect of the situation is dealt with better, um, people like Trump are going to carry on, winning. I'm afraid to say.
No, it's a shame. It just doesn't.
Well, I
It
hope not.
doesn't.
I really.
Well, I mean, well, there's all we can speculate on all that. I mean, who
Mm,
knows? I mean, anything can happen. Well, this is the thing, Well, I said in my book, Dark Star Rising, where I say Trump is a singularity with the first
mm,
election. A singularity is supposed to be everything's different. Say the black hole, everything's different inside. If there is an inside to a black
mm.
hole, everything's different. the new age singularity with, the McKenna's time wave or whatever things are going to happen.
Yes.
Blah, blah, blah. So, but with Trump electing, everything was different. Everything was different. Everything was changed. And, I think it was his daughter that said at the Republican convention at the previous election, it's like, now everything will be possible. Well, yes, and but that not only good things that are possible. When you say everything is possible,
Yeah.
it's like everything is possible. And I don't
It's
know
terrifying.
if people still talk about the Overton window, which is like what was acceptable, but it's it was getting wider and wider. With the once fashionable but now forgotten alt right. That kind of ultra conservatism it was like in Cosmopolitan for briefly. It was like something cool or something. But now the Overton window is just smashed. There's nothing. It's like what's acceptable? I mean, what's acceptable? Just a what do you say? A narcissistic psychopath sitting in the seat of the most powerful country in the world. Well, I guess that's acceptable. I don't know. Who am I to judge? It's just like, my God, so what I'm saying is that reality is up for grabs. I mean, reality, that's the real thing that's been up for grabs now since, his first election. And the story I tell on Dark Star Rising, it's a variety of different avenues of thought or approaches that all come together, the notion that reality is malleable. So there's Trump's, he's a devotee of positive thinking, the power of positive thinking, Norman Vincent Peale.
Yeah.
Um, then there's the whole reality TV thing, which is like power of positive thinking. Thoughts control things. Thoughts make, and the big takeaway from that is actually a line from the psychologist Carl Menninger, where he says, it's not things that are important. It's what we feel about things, or it's not facts that are important. It's what we think about the facts, which goes back to Epictetus, the Greek Stoic philosopher, who basically said it's not the way things are that trouble us, is what we think about the way things are. So we have no control of the way things are. We can control how we think about them. And for Epictetus and the Stoics, it's a defensive measure. It's a retreat back to, well, I have no control over what's happening around me, but I can control my thoughts. So I control my reactions to things. And it's not a surprise that these days books about Stoicism are very, very popular. At least I can tell from Amazon. So
Yes.
they're very popular during times of trouble. But the turnaround is like, okay, if it's facts don't matter and it's what I think that matters, then screw the facts. I'll just focus on what I want, completely tunnel vision, absolutely, focused, narrowly laser beam like focused onto this kind of thing. And that's, and I'll make that reality, I'll turn that into reality. So go ahead.
It's kind of like a monstrous version of cosmic ordering, isn't it, really?
Mm.
But you see, I think that's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of a lot of that, like you said, of that earlier literature, sort of twisted in a very incredibly egocentric way. I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I trust my ego in charge of the universe. I think it's much better to let the universe do its own thing.
Well, we are mere mortals, that's that's as it should be. But there are some who tempt the gods, but I mean, but that all that stuff is in the context of, well, I can't even go into how the alt-right claimed to have used the internet to help Trump win by flooding it with memes of Pepe the Frog. I can't even go there. That's too complicated. But I think you also have Trump, for years being The Apprentice, that TV show.
Yes.
The most popular thing for decades now is reality TV. So the television's got so much reality being shoved into it. Something popped out. It was Trump. So the simulacra, the simulation became the real thing, whereas it was the way around. The real thing became the simulation on the television screen. And then in the background of that, you have the whole academic idea going on again for decades, that there's no reality with a capital R. There's no truth with capital T, the whole deconstruction postmodern thing, which is more of the left and the progressive side. But they undermine any, in the attempt to liberate whoever from the oppressive, forces of past thinking, they undermine any stable reality. And a chancellor like Trump, I'm sure he's never heard of postmodernism, or maybe in an architectural sense, because he was real estate. But yeah, oh, reality is malleable. It's yeah, I can change. Oh yeah, okay, fine, I'll go with that. And he grabbed it. That's what he did, and he that's what he's done. It's amazing. I mean, in one sense, you have to think, how did this happen? How, I mean, I know there's all real world reasons. You know, the groceries are
Yeah.
expensive, and nobody liked Biden and stuff like that. But still, what we said, you know, so he's somehow, and again, one doesn't want to make these cliched analogies, but Hitler sleepwalked through from
Yeah.
success to success to success. Eventually, he ran into a wall. But in you know, the first half, let's say, of his adventure, he kind of just, you know, everything just fell before him. So who knows? Maybe he's building up to a fall. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I do hope so because like here, it's felt not only has he sleepwalked between successes, but also we've seen, well, I mean, I didn't sleepwalk through it. I mean, if you listen to people like Mary Trump, who's his niece, who's very
Mm.
critical, who's always been very critical, always seen basically how psychologically damaged he is, which is always quite obvious to me too. I mean, after 3 minutes, but then you talk to other people, and it's like they've seen the second coming or something. But honestly, I don't understand it, Gary, and I hope that what we can do is recover some more healthy philosophy going forward. I don't want to end this on too much of a
Yeah. Well, I mean,
no,
I think yourself, myself, other people. And there's lots of other people out there who reject all this stuff. You know, I mean, they do. They're out there, and they're working. So and I always think of you know, they call it quantum entanglement. So you've got the two particles, they're close together, they talk to each other, and then bang, they're there. They don't communicate, but they know exactly what they're doing. They're still in touch, even though they're not contiguous in some way. And then in the brain, there's neurons that are associated with certain operations, but they're not next to each other, but they fire simultaneously. So it's not as if one neuron, you know, gives the next one an elbow and
yeah.
tells it, oh, it's not in a train, it's all in different bits. So I'd like to think globally on the planet, there's lots of different people out there. They don't know each other, but perhaps what they are doing collectively or cumulatively will add up to something like, you know, the quantum entanglement or the neurons firing, you know, somehow. We're talking, and you know, I talk to some people, but there's lots and lots of people out there that, you know, we never reach, and you know,
I hope so.
you know, well, I think there is, but I think it's something that, you know, well, if they're outsiders, they're not. Well, they're not going to be the most popular. Nobody's going to know about them necessarily.
Because I mean, I think that's my takeaway from Colin Wilson. It's you don't have to rely on gurus or other people. Everything you need really is within your own self if you can activate it, and that will link you to the wider world. And I think that's such a crucial part of his
Yeah,
his ideas.
yeah. No, I think the time of the guru is over, and I think for better or worse, each of us has to, you know, plunge in head first, and you know, do the best we can, and that's it. You know, that's all you can do. I mean, everything starts here, wherever it is, and you know, there's all those books out there. There's Collins, there's other people, there's tons of stuff out there, and there's so much stuff online now. I personally would distrust 90% of what you see online, and I go get the books. Get old
Yes.
books. Actually, get old books written maybe 20, 30 years ago, and start with those, because I think they'll give you a bit of grounding than anything you'll pick up these days in some way. I mean, maybe I'm undermining my own sales, but if you know what I mean, though. But no, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful, but it's certainly, you know, we're certainly in a difficult time now. So there's no, we shouldn't kid ourselves about it. But there's no need to despair.
Absolutely. I mean, just to finish off, so you mentioned that you were working on a new book on Faculty X, but you also mentioned that you're going to hopefully get your Colin Wilson book
Mm.
reprinted. So just tell me a little bit about those two projects to finish.
Well, the Colin Wilson book is called Beyond the Robot, Life and Work of Colin Wilson, something like that. And yeah, it was in print with Penguin. Went out of print last year. Sadly, but just wasn't selling. And one way I'm not surprised. I mean, he's not that known. He's more known here in the UK than he is in the States. Excuse me. And but it's, the copyright came back to me, so I'm hoping to either find another publisher for it or publish it myself. And it's basically a study of his all of his work. I mean, one of the things about Colin is that he wrote so much. I mean, depending on what you count as a book or a booklet, he certainly wrote close to 200, 100 sort of full-on books, and maybe another of that of these sort of booklets and things of that sort. An enormous amount of work. And but there's one central idea running through all of it, and different things that he themes he brings up in all of the books, starting with the outsider. And so what I do in the book is basically go through all of that, and also at my encounters with him. I made a pilgrimage to his home in Cornwall in 1983 when I was it's a long time ago now, when I was over here on what I call a mini search for the miraculous with a friend of mine. And we went to places like Glastonbury and Avebury and Stonehenge, and then Chartres and Notre Dame. And we went to the site of Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man that he had in Fontainebleau in the 1920s and things like that. And then on a separate leg of the journey, I made a pilgrimage down to Cornwall to meet Colin. And that was 1983. And that was the start of a friendship, we had over the years, corresponded. And he actually, when I was living in Los Angeles, when he was there giving talks, he actually stayed with me. This memoir I've written last year, but it's be coming out at the end of this year. I tell the story of when one time I was working at it was a bookshop. It used to be a bookshop in Los Angeles called the Bodhi Tree, which was a very well-known metaphysical New Age bookshop. It's not there anymore. This would have been the late 80s. And he was in town, and I was house sitting for one of the owners, and they had this fantastic place in Laurel Canyon in the Hollywood Hills. They called it a Zen castle. It was like 3 floors, and it had a terrace garden and a jacuzzi. And he and his wife Joy was staying in some little motel. And I said, why don't you come where I'm staying? And it was, oh yeah. So that was lovely. So they stayed with me at this place, and we had some parties and things like that. So I told these stories. So no, I got to know him fairly well. And so yeah, that's coming out. And this other book, as I said, I had this strange experience where I was surprised by the sun. And one of my publishers, the florist who did the book Dreaming Ahead of Time, they just recently asked me, so do you have any ideas for any books? And I said, well, I had this odd experience. And I described it, and I had written an article about it. I think it's called Getting Beyond the Robot. It's online. You can find it if you look for it. And so I'm looking into these different sort. It's like different I mean, it's a kind of the Zen Satori moment is like that. The peak experience, self-remembering, faculty X, non-robotic consciousness. Or the opposite, why is it that we what do you want to say? Is it, we don't necessarily want to be struck dumb and awestruck all the time in front of, the blazing glory of reality, which is what's really out there. So it's understandable that, as Bergson and Huxley says, we have the brain
Yes.
cuts it down, but if you cut it down too much, it's like, yeah, you can maneuver through the world, but you get this whole sense that this meaningless thing. And the meaning that you perceive in those moments is not something you can say, oh, it's this. Oh, here it is. It's not explicit. It's not explicit. Yeah. It's the same kind of meaning when you hear fantastic music, great Beethoven, Mozart, whatever. And it's not about nothing. It's not just waves of air, fluffing about. But it's not about anything you can say explicitly. And this is one of the things, I mentioned Ian McGilchrist. Just briefly, I can say, I'll be giving a talk later this year in July, I think it is. There's a Colin Wilson conference that's going to be happening here in Soho. Actually, it's just a one-day thing.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah. And it's, I'm going to be giving a talk about Colin Wilson's double brain, because he wrote a lot about the left and right brain. And in more recent years, Ian McGilchrist had rebooted the whole left and right brain discussion with his book Master and His Emissary that came out like 2009, and he has a huge opus out now about the matter with things. But my talk will be about how, I mean, McGilchrist's thing is just overflowing with data and neurological evidence, stuff like that. And Colin's an intuitive, writer and thinker, so it's not the same thing. But many of the things he was saying back in the early 80s about the relationship between the two brains is very much what Gilchrist is saying, in different contexts. That's another thing I'll be looking at. And you could say that the left brain dominance is the thing that cuts out all of that kind of implicit meaning that the right brain supplies. And we've all had those moments when you look at a leaf and it's the first time you've seen the leaf, even though you've seen hundreds of leaves hundreds of times. But then in that moment, somehow, what's happening then? Well, Satori, the robot's not worth speak experience, or it's the right brain. So all of those things. All of those things are what's contributing, or different ways of talking about what's happening in those moments. I'm going to try to nail it, what it is. And then also the context of being, the whole, like, why is there something rather than nothing? Which sounds like the stupidest question ever, but in one sense, it's like the fundamental question. Science will tell us, well, for no reason whatsoever. As Stephen Hawking says, what was it? A quantum fluctuation in a pre-existing vacuum, which to me just says it happened. Well, we know it. So fancy talk way of saying the universe happened. But we know it happened, Stephen. We want to know why it happened, which they'll never say that.
I think they misunderstand the question. It's like, I don't think it was Hawking. I mean, Hawking did say something like that, but there was another physicist who wrote a book saying, now we know why there was something from nothing. And it is just the quantum fluctuation in a quantum wave. And I feel that's completely missing the point that, existence isn't a naturalistic phenomenon, because it comes before naturalistic explanations.
Anything we could possibly have to say about it already is we're not outside it looking at it. Oh, yes, it's like that. No, it's like Kierkegaard saying, okay, that's great. And how does it help me get around Copenhagen? That was his argument against Hegel. But it's like, but at least we're leaving it on the joke. So it's been lovely having this talk.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm very much looking forward to your new book, and also with the new edition of the Colin Wilson one. So, Gary Lachman, thank you very much for being a guest.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you.
What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. This podcast accompanies the What Lies Beyond book by Matt Coburn, now available for pre-order on Amazon. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.